the issue is a Marshall Plan with Africa, development aid and investment. And there are skeptics, there are those who see this as a positive development. But before we get there, I thought it would be a good idea to hear from each of the panelists exactly what they're doing now, particularly focused on this area. And so let me go first right at the beginning to Hina. What are you doing in this area, which is particularly important for the Marshall Plan with Africa and development aid and investment? And then we'll move on with some of the issues.
Well, I'm a lawyer and a human rights defender in my own country. So a lot of things that I do are going towards building a society that believes in peace, in tolerance, and accommodation. So that's one thing. On the particular issue of refugees and migrants, I'm co-chairing an initiative by the Canadian government, which is called the World Refugee Council, for which we were here in Berlin and in this foundation discussing the many things that have been talked about in the morning.
Good, okay, Leymah. And you have expressed frustration that one of the questions hasn't been answered yet from Liberia.
Definitely. I spend a lot of my time now investing in education and leadership opportunities for young people in the sub-region, but also using my voice to advocate for peaceful resolution to conflict. Yes, my frustration, if I have to speak about it, Hina and I serve on that World Refugee Council group. But I feel like, and I think I'm going to jump straight into the Marshall Plan. If we have to do a Marshall Plan for Africa, there must be a Marshall Plan for sex trafficking and a Marshall Plan on a different way of resolving conflict other than militarism.
Thank you very much indeed. Franz, we've heard from you already, but what are you doing now in your consultancy?
Well, in my consultancy, I'm doing nothing. But what I'm really doing is I'm the chairman of the so-called European Forum Alpbach, and within this forum we deal every year with issues like sustainability, also the SDGs. This is one of the major discussion points in this forum. What I am also doing is I deal a lot with global food security, because in the past I was responsible for agriculture, and for example I chaired during the Expo Milano an international forum or an international working group, and we worked out a plan, or maybe plan is too much, but some principles how one can make real progress to guarantee food security.
John Prendergast.
So the Aurora Prize co-chair, George Clooney, and I, just a couple of years ago, formed a new initiative called The Sentry. And we've hired a team of financial forensic investigators to basically to follow the money, to go after the illicit finance, the illicit financial flows of dictators and warlords and militia leaders and others who are destroying a number of African countries as a result of war. And looking at the internationalization of that money, where using the banks, partnering with mining companies and others, where the money goes, how it can be identified, traced, identified, and recovered as potentially a reverse Marshall Plan for Africa.
And what is the level of tracking success that you have?
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing, because we're using the same tools that are used for counterterrorism efforts, right? But the terrorist groups have years of hiding these finances. Drug traffickers have years of using shell companies to hide their illicit gains. But a lot of these dictators and others in Africa and their international collaborators and enablers, they have not had to hide. No one's looking for their money. No one uses these tools of financial pressure that we use to counter terrorism and to counter nuclear proliferation. They don't worry about their finances. So they're out hiding in plain sight. So we're able to track a lot of it. Now it's to build the political will of governments to take action against these assets, to create a different environment for the looting of these states.
John, thank you. Bernard Kouchner.
Well, I'm working in Africa and Middle East, especially in the health sector, that is to say, not only to build up hospitals sometimes, but to talk about health insurance, to talk about and sometimes to try to get it. And also in Middle East, and health in Middle East in the wartime, it's sort of a problem.
Thank you. Right, there's a lot of very good points raised by you. More and more were coming in the last session, particularly using whatever your keyboard you're using. But one here from Sandrine Tillo, which I've held over. There is a different legal protection for refugees and migrants. Is that holding us back from finding solutions for the many reasons why people move? Should we abolish the term refugee, or will that reduce protection? So I leave that on the table to emerge in the next couple of hours. The next thing, and I've warned them about this, I'd like literally an elevator pitch, not a slow elevator pitch, but a normal elevator pitch, on what you think about the idea of a Marshall Plan for Africa, in a minute.
With the exception of the name that it's been given, I think the plan does have merit. But, using that name has certain connotations. Why do you, in a changed world, want to go back in history and use the word Marshall Plan? Secondly, I heard the speaker just before our panel. What I understand from that plan is development aid, investment. Who's investing in the civil society in those countries? Who are the biggest change makers? And the people who can in some way have a better potential to ensure that stability remains within a particular society, and that the state conforms to a certain conduct that improves governance, that respects people's rights, that also respects its own responsibilities, and undertakes the duty to protect, to provide, and to make an environment where people feel comfortable living in their own countries. So I didn't hear that.
Okay, well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
You might go back to the Chancellor with some extra ideas this afternoon. Leymah, what's your view about... So we've had one thought, which is good as an idea, but with limitations, and certainly no need to connect it to the Marshall Plan.
Well, I would say that, do we really need a Marshall Plan for Africa? There's an Agenda 2063 by the Africa Union. What would be the political buy-in, not just from our leaders who excitedly accept, most of them, the money from Europe, but how about local people, partnership? What impact is it going to have on local perspective? Is it not reinforcing the same old idea of Western savior complex? These are all questions that come to mind when we talk about Marshall Plan for Africa. I think it should be an African plan for Africa, not a German Marshall Plan for Africa.
Okay, we'll come back to funding. Franz, quick, your 1-minute version. Do you agree with the Marshall Plan or not?
I do not agree with the term Marshall Plan because of all the arguments which were already raised, and I have a bit of problem as long as we have a so-called Marshall Plan containing more or less only headlines and not much more. Yeah. So what is needed urgently are real projects on the spot, and also an answer to the questions when we speak about development cooperation, who should cooperate with whom? Yeah, it's clear in the Marshall Plan. It is clearly said that government to government is not enough. So private initiative, private investment is important. But I would argue this is also not enough. So we need also cooperation, for example, amongst the researchers, cooperation amongst civil society institutions, cooperation between universities, cooperation between medical experts, and many other forms of cooperation. I think this would bring us forward. And I fully agree with the position to say, well, we are not to teach Africa how they should develop. We can work a bit as a catalyst, a bit as a supporter, but the initiative and the driving force must come from Africa itself.
Right, we'll pick up that. John.
Can't disagree with any of all that, and I think it's very important to build on. But there's a prerequisite, I think, for any aid and investment-driven plan, regardless of what it is and what it's called. The problem, I think, the essential problem that exists now is the set of incentive structures. For many governments in Africa, the incentive structures favor mass looting, mass corruption, and in many cases, terrible violence, repression against independent voices of opposition, civil society. There are no consequences for these actions. And in the absence of consequences, you're going to see a continuation of the behavior, and the investment and aid will potentially improve some people's lives in the places where the projects occur. But in general, the systems remain in place. The figure now of the money that is looted out of Africa by African leaders and their international accomplices is roughly, if you listen to Thabo Mbeki and the Economic Commission for Africa, it's in the neighborhood of $80 billion a year. Let's go over any plan that anyone has ever forwarded for Africa, and it's nowhere near that amount. The money is in Africa. There is a huge natural resource wealth. There's an incredible personal, there's incredible labor force that is latent and unutilized. So my view is very strongly that we need to somehow affect those incentive structures to gear them away from looting and violence and repression and authoritarianism and towards peace and the rule of law and the peaceful development of these countries.
Thank you, John. Bernard.
Well, it's easy to say that African Marshall Plan is better than European or so-called Marshall Plan. But it's easy to say, but very difficult to do. So there is an African Commission and there is an African Union. And we should do that with them. With, if you like, because it was the same case in European Union. European Union and African Union must lead, I think so. And including the fact that we are not only offering money, but certainly partly fight against corruption, fight against, in favor of stability, and fight against the real problem of Africa. But having a Marshall Plan is only one benefit, one advantage. People in the Occidental world, they know what it means. But in Africa, they don't know, and they should be part of. Second, in the particular sector I'm used to, health, are you able, compare to the big differences in between the countries, to have one Marshall Plan? It's impossible. You really have to talk and to work with the people in instruction, in education, and also with the patient, and also with the people in charge, I mean the medical staff, etc. So this is very delicate to get a Marshall Plan, that is to say at the level of the clouds or the sky, and having a real impact and a real exchange. And all the ideas are not coming from Europe. In Africa there is a lot of economists right now, and the development is high. And the growth is in between 7 to 9%. So we have the material. It should be certainly the result of a real, not confrontation, but addition of ideas and sort of Marshall Plan. It was easy. It was very difficult, but it was coming. Money was coming from United States, and it was after the war. Now there is a big deal of development with yesterday. Africa is a place where they are jumping one generation. They didn't get fixed line of telephone, now they have a mobile. And this is the same. We can shorten the distance in between what we have done and what they should do right now. So who is the African? Marshall Plan is an Occidental term.
And of course, with their mobile phones, they even do banking.
Oh, banking,
which is more than many other countries. Right, Günter Nooke, can I just come in and put 3 of those points, because I want to drill down into some of the detail. Do we really need a Marshall Plan? I mean, Leymah's view, it needs to be an Africa plan, not a Marshall Plan. In other words, even calling it the Marshall Plan, is that a bad idea?
The claim has been already discussed in the ministry and with the minister, but it was his decision by a decision maker, and it's okay. It was successfully. It was because of public relations. Everyone is speaking about the Marshall Plan of the Germans.
But does it send the wrong signal?
Or the renaming of the Merkel Plan or the Müller Plan or whatever. It's not the term. It's not the wording. It's about the content. So I'm not very. I was not in favor of this name, but it was successful in this in the sense of putting Africa in the focus of our G20 presidency and in the focus of the European Union, others. So, and I haven't mentioned money. It's not about money. That's the problem with the term. Marshall Plan, so originally, one was about money, but also about commitments and a kind of dictate by the allies. So it's a sensitive term, of course.
All right, well, let me pick up on another couple of points. Bernard Kouchner, Marshall Plan, very easy to say and do, far more difficult to implement. And secondly, what Franz Fischler said, we need more than headlines. I mean, you were only speaking for 10 minutes.
The first thing is, you mentioned also Europe. Of course, the Marshall Plan is not something for Germany to push the Agenda 2063 as one country in the European Union with the entire continent. So we have to do something at a European level. And how we call it, it's not what I'm speaking about. It's about this kind of investments. And that is the answer to you. We are speaking about job creation in Africa. We can have cooperation at any level, everywhere, with civil society organization, with different sectors, and at the national level, regional level, the local levels, whatever. But in the end, you need the private sector to create reliable growth, broad-based growth, to have jobs. In Germany, we have spoken about this selbsttragenden Aufschwung in East Germany. So we need such an growth, not only the 5 or 10% by raw materials, to extract raw materials and have a kind of growth by remittances or by printing money, or so it's not in the liberal economy that we have to look for money. We have to look for indigenous growth.
Well, but I think if you go to the smallest village in Africa and ask some of the young people who have not even made it to class 6, what are their needs? They will tell you job creation. Do we need the Germans to come and tell our leaders who are educated that they have to create jobs for the youth? While there is an appreciation for this, the message is sent out there is that, and we are constantly, as activists, saying to the rest of the world, for development to actually catch, let it be homegrown. Let there be a buy-in by local people. And so if we see at this level it's coming from outside, I don't think this is something that is going to work. We all know in Africa we need healthcare, we need job creation, we need to revise our educational system. We don't need guns and bombs, and half of our governments spend almost 50% of their budgets on defense. If they were investing in basic human needs, basic human security needs, we won't be having this problem. And so I think it's a waste of the German taxpayer money for you to be spending your energy on creating a plan for Africa when Africans already know that this is what needs to be done. This is my point, Bernard.
I do not agree. That's totally not what I have heard by Africans. I have spoken to heads of state and government and also to the poorest in the faraway areas, rural areas. So it's a kind of opinion of the
I represent some of the poorest, and I think
everyone is representing a civil society. Me too. So I do not agree, and I think we have to tackle the issue of migrations, and that many people coming to Germany coming without this kind of prospects for their personal life. So
we agree that we have to tackle migration. I agree with you 100%. But I'm saying your plan is not the right plan for tackling migration. What you stand to do is to grease the pockets of most of our politicians again.
That good governance is an issue in the plan.
All right, John Prendergast.
And we have awarded 3 countries as reform partners.
May I?
Of course.
Thank you. Don't start making war because of one word.
Yeah.
We need to help Africa, and they need to help us. So it's an exchange.
It's in our own interest, of course.
Take over the Marshall name, because this is a situated name. It's after the war, and coming from Germany, we all remember what was the state of Europe and the poverty and etc. Take it out, and let's talk about an African plan.
Will you'll be taking that message back? You'll be taking that message back to your minister, will you?
The minister is knowing my opinion, and we referred to Agenda 2063, an agenda of the Africans. That is the African plan, and we want to support this kind of African program for development.
Can I just check one thing, because Leymah talked about guns and bombs. This money does not include weaponry, does it?
It's not.
No, I just wanted to be clear. All right, John, kleptocracy, the amount of money that is it will be stolen because of this.
I mean, that's a key point. And nobody intends, as a government donor or as an investor, you don't intend to have your money stolen, of course not. But let's look at the case of the post-migration inflows in the last couple of years in Europe's compact with a number of African states. Take Sudan, for example. Sudan is being viewed by a number of European countries as a government that they can work with to stem the tide of migration. The president of that country has been indicted for genocide and war crimes. The money goes to the paramilitary entity that is tasked by the government with attempting to block the flood of, or the flow, sorry, let's use the right terminology, the flow of migrants out of Sudan across the Mediterranean. And so you have an insane situation where European money is funding the security apparatus of a genocidal state, because, by the way, they're still committing crimes against humanity in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, even though the public has moved on. And the funding goes primarily to train and professionalize the very entities known a decade ago as the Janjaweed, now sanitized as the Rapid Support Force, the RSF, as the principal means by which they're going to counter that migration. I mean, so in other words, the big ticket financial inflows are in the interests, of course, of Europe, because everybody does what they have to do in their own self-interest. But the effect that it has, as Leymah is saying often, is the opposite, because you're reinforcing the very structure of oppression that is causing migration crazily. And so you couldn't have created a more sort of Alice in Wonderland story here of perverse incentives making. Now, that's not your intention. I know that, and nobody's accusing you of that. But the outcome when you engage and you support these kinds of, when other governments, the United States, Europe, supports governments, especially the security sector, these are the implications. These are the practical results of the assistance.
Can I, Franz Josef Kuhn, we met yesterday, and you are working in Malawi. I know you've just stepped back into the room, but could I ask you to come in, because you are a German, you live in Essen, and we only met at this time yesterday afternoon, and you showed me your work that you're doing with the next generation of kids, with your device, which allows them to learn the basics of computing and other things in villages. I think you said 12 villages. You're based in Essen. I'm just interested, if you have been listening to the conversation and you were asking me about raising funds for this modest-sized box with 6 trays in it, with solar cells on the top, which allows the next generation to learn new skills. Now, what I'm literally doing this on the fly here. I'm interested what you need and what you think is needed as a German in a place like Malawi to bring on the next generation who might one day feel so fed up that they want to leave Africa and head for Europe.
Thank you very much. If I want to curb the migration, I think we should build a basis for STEM subjects and concrete technical experiences in African schools. So we can help to develop profession orientation and following vocational training and simple higher and higher qualified professions, and last not least, job creations.
But does a massive amount of cash injection, let's not call it the Marshall Plan, but like that, do you think that works in a place like where you've been working?
But I know the Marshall Plan is working with companies, not with NGOs. We are an NGO, this is another problem. And I spoke with Mr. Nooke in the front, and he said, yes, we can not work together.
We cannot work together, is that the case?
I was asked by Mr. Kuhn regarding his project, and he also received an answer by ministry. I repeated what he have heard. So we can do something together, but we have to ask, is it right that the civil society and NGOs can create reliable jobs, or we have all over the world, globally, the same model of growth? Maybe it's the wrong one, but I have not the idea to create reliable jobs and growth in a way without the private sector, and that Africa will produce products with an acceptable price and quality, who is able and willing to buy it at first in Africa itself and for the global world market. So there are, in Africa we have the problem of low productivity, or that nothing will be produced in Africa. So what can NGOs do against this?
Leymah.
Education is very necessary. I spoke about skills,
Hina, do you want to go?
but education is also, or even vocational training is a trigger for migration if there is no private company to can hire the people.
You know, I'm not from Africa, so I can't say for sure whether I'm right or not, but I don't see any country, in my experience as a human rights defender and working with networks from all over the world of civil society, that there are not local initiatives that are doing exactly what you say is not being done in Africa. It's there. But let me also say that let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. African governments can misuse and misappropriate and misapply funds. That's quite apparent because we can see the realities. However, it is also true that the people of Africa have certain aspirations. And I would say that if there is to be a development aid plan, it has to invest in the people's aspirations. Now, how do you do it? Coming from Pakistan, I can say one of the things that we have learned is strengthen local governments. Put money into local governance. At the smaller level of administration, it's perhaps better to manage, especially in countries like mine where there is a galloping population. So there are lack of resources, but also too many people to cater for. Big administrative units mean inefficiencies. Smaller administrative units at the local level. So these are the kind, and I'm just giving this as an example. I'm not saying that's the be-all, that strengthen local governance, but that's one of the things that not only makes people nearer to governance, that's the place. Secondly, invest in national and regional institutions. Why should not the AU be stronger, more independent, more responsible towards the people of Africa. And why do the people of Africa, would the people of Africa have to look towards Europe for guidance on how to redress the wrongs that they know about? You know, when I was a young human rights activist, I learned my first lesson of humility when a woman I was talking to and explaining, giving, in my estimation, legal awareness to women on their rights. And they got up and told me, we know all this. You tell us what is the way out. So we don't need to know what is wrong with our lives. We need to see a way where we can collectively find the right path. And I think this is the kind of, you know, the kind of ideology with which you plan development aid. I'm not saying that people don't need that money. They need that money. But how it is applied, whether the governments should be the sole owners of decision-making over the application of development aid, whether the donor should be the sole decision-maker on the application of that aid, that's something that we have followed so far, and it has not worked. So find innovative ways of including people in decision-making.
Now, Franz, I know you have the microphone, but Leymah has to...
has also one.
Yeah, but you both have microphones now, so I'm going to adjudicate here, but Leymah has to leave in 7 minutes. So as she represents Africa on this panel, I need to hear from you about what your reaction is.
Well, one of the things that I, as an African sitting on this panel, I would actually say, and this is not anything personal, but it's about the lives and the livelihood of myself and people that I care for. It's the first assumption that this entire migration problem is an African fault. That's the wrong assumption. And that is the assumption that the Marshall Plan projects, or the idea of the Marshall Plan. Libya has come up more than 100 times, and Libya happens to be now the big elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. How did we get to the place where that country has been so volatile that we have droves of people now passing through? Is it not NATO? Is it not the same NATO, French, Britain, Germany, and some others who took out Gaddafi? $500+ billion investment in militarism and chicken change for nation building. This is what you get at the doorstep of Europe. Let's own up to that. That's the first thing. Who's benefiting from the sex trade? I was reading CNN, and there's a statistics of young Nigerians that have been coming through. And I'll keep it to Nigeria because they're also big in this. 2011, 1,317 young women came by boat. 2012, 85. 2013, 433. By 2014, 1,400. Last year, 11,099. The question is, who's recruiting? Because from Nigeria, 11,000 from last year, 11,099 young women by boat. And a lot of them end up in brothels in Europe. And there is a key recruitment now happening in Nigeria, from churches to schools to all of these things. So I want us, even as we talk about solving this problem in Africa, let's look at some of the sources in Europe, because it's not just an African issue. If we continue to use militarism as a way of solving problems, what war does to people is that it gives them less hope. That's the second thing. Please, I know you want to destroy me, but the other point about
You're badly informed, if I may say.
Well, the other point about the Marshall Plan is, if you're talking we can't work with civil society organizations, your plan has died before it even arrived on the scene. Because it is civil society organization in the absence of functional government that are keeping societies together in Africa. They are the ones doing education, healthcare, and all of the different things. So if you cannot work with civil society, government, civil society institution, you're just going to enrich another group from politicians now to private sector, please, then let's keep the Marshall Plan in Germany. Let's do a Marshall Plan for poor German communities.
Dr. Nooke, would you like to just respond so Leymah hears your responses?
I served as a human rights commissioner at the federal office, foreign office as well before I came into this position of a special envoy for the Chancellor in the development ministry. So I know the worth and how helpful civil society organization can be. I want to say that the Marshall Plan was not only the response because of the migration issue. I mentioned the G20 presidency of Germany and the contribution of my minister. The G20 countries are not willing to speak about civil society, good governance and other things. It's a group founded by the financial crisis, 2008, and only with India, China, Brazil and other countries, and India, like Russia or others, are not interested to speak about this good governance issue. So you have to also recognize that this kind of focusing on investment is one thing. The Marshall Plan is about good governance, peace and security, and of course this change of the narrative I mentioned in the beginning of the development community to use the money for our very, maybe more or less agreed issues or goals for development or for economic growth in those countries. So I think the problem is to mix this with the military sector. It's a different issue. We are interested in a kind of peace and security architecture in Africa and strengthen the African Union and the African Union Commission. Many problems or even conflicts or wars have been solved by the Africans themselves, but they are looking for European money, and sometimes that's the other things. In the EU summit last week, we have also heard, put the money on the table and go away. We have our own standards and we will do it, but it's not our opinion to cooperate as a partner. We want to spend money for giving support for reasonable goals and programs of the Africans, but not that we spend the money and they will, I agree with you, the illicit flows, that so much money will leave the country.
Right.
That is a real problem.
Well,
one thing is interesting also to hear from the Africans. I have heard this, or I heard this in the margin of the summit. Some heads of state in Africa said, we are not really interested in too much private investment and using the development money only for triggering private investments. It's better that the money from your ministry is coming to my ministry or to the government. It's much better for corruption. And the private companies are protected.
All right, well, let's get a reality check from John here.
What will be a kind of,
all right, because I want
new perspective that the heads of state have to agree that there is too much corruption.
All right, well,
politicians have the other problem that we have to deal, for instance, in the security sector with sovereign states.
Right, but
so and that is between civil society and sovereign states. We are a little bit in a kind of in between, and of course, I cannot solve this problem.
All right, before Leymah has to leave for a flight, John, given what she said, particularly about what CNN have been broadcasting, horrendous stuff, and the massive sex trade, just literally from Nigeria, but far broader as well, is what you're investigating, are those that you're investigating able to stop this, or are they profiting so much that they have no interest in ending what Leymah has put twice on the agenda today?
Well, when the world got serious after 9/11 about countering the financial flows of terrorist organizations, a number of regulations were changed in key governments where the money was flowing through. The banks strengthened their regulatory capacities. The treaties were signed, And by and large, I can tell you, though, of course, the problem of terrorism continues and deepens for many other reasons. The difficulty of moving money for terrorist organizations has gotten very, very difficult. If you see the transcripts from what they found.
And the kleptocrats, though, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but the point is that when they get serious, we can do something about it. And so there are laws now and regulations and methodologies to go after that money. Billions and billions of dollars going out of the continent that are simply lining the pockets, going into luxury real estate and all the rest of it for a very small group of people. And by the way, it takes two to tango. It's mining companies and the international banks that are making tremendous amounts of money off of Africa's misery. So the key point, I think, here is that the answer is yes. We could, if there was political will, to use the anti-money laundering measures that we've used against terrorist organizations to go after the money of kleptocrats and their international facilitators, you would be talking about billions of dollars that would not leave the African continent, and the kinds of things that spur local development, keeping the money in those communities where the natural resource wealth exists and the extraordinary ideas for development exist. I think it would be a different story.
Bernard, then Franz.
Well, I don't know what we are talking about. First,
do you want to wait?
No, no, but because there is no chance to understand. Let
me say something.
Don't leave. Don't leave. First, remember, please, there's a big difference in between economical migrants and migration. Please, some are leaving because there is a war, 2, 3, etc. This is not always our responsibility. We are part of, but not all wars. We are absolutely not well. What about Nigeria? What is going on to Nigeria? Are we responsible if they are leaving? Are we responsible because it's richer than Nigeria? Nigeria is the richest part of Africa. Why are they leaving? Because of us. Don't give us the responsibility of everything. I'm sorry, but we are... No, please.
No one is giving the responsibility.
You were.
No, no, no. The point that I'm making is, let's not make migration and refugee issue a blame for Africa only. Let Europe do some self-checking.
What were we doing in Nigeria badly?
No,
so
I'm not saying you're doing anything in Nigeria, but you're using Nigeria as an example. It's good for this to get rowdy before.
No, but the corruption, of course.
Found the oil money, lined the pockets of the autocrats in Nigeria, took away
John.
It's a very direct result of this phenomenon.
Of what? Of your car?
Phenomenon of
you are using oil for your car. No, we are not responsible for that.
In this round, if you are polite, you are the loser. So therefore, I would like to come in.
Franz, I'm just going to say, do we have a conciliator in the House, please? Anyone who can do reconciliation?
No, I would only like to make 2 points. Yeah? The first point is to you, Mr. Nooke, because I really don't understand if this is really the main aim, what you said, that this plan is about creating jobs in the industry in Africa. I give you the absolute guarantee it will fail. Why? Why? Because you can do development only in the context, only with a system approach. This sectoral approach is over. This is the time of the past.
I haven't spoken about the sectoral approach.
But you said that the other things like research, cooperation, and all these things is on the secondary place. Primarily, it's about job creation. This is what you said. And to you, I have a small question. And this is what I don't understand with Africa. Why do you say that if there is a cooperation plan between Europe and Africa, this is neo-colonialism, and what is then your form of cooperation with China?
I think you're misunderstanding me completely. My point is, if there should be a plan for Africa on migration, let it be a collective plan. You can't come to us, and that was my point. You can't come to us with a superimposed plan to say this is how we think it should be. It will fail. Let me tell you something. When it comes to migration, recently everyone has been appalled by what we see happening in Libya. every community has been asking themselves. And I'll say this and leave. One, for us to tackle the migration issue is political, is at the middle level, and is at the grassroots level. At the community and local NGO level, you need women in the community to stop their children from making that trend. You need to find a way of empowering these women so that they too can see a better future. Education, as he spoke, is important. So it's a holistic approach, not just a private sector approach to the migration crisis, until we begin to see it from that perspective. And this is not something that only Europe can bring to us. Our leaders need to stand up, local community leaders need to be involved, because it's touching everyone and every home in Africa right now. So I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is, let it be an African plan for an African problem. Okay. Thank you very much. No bad blood here.
Hey, nothing personal, huh? Be good.
An African plan for an African problem. Margarita, I think you should come and replace her, because I think we need an African on a panel about Africa. Yes. So I think you need to come and join me, okay? And also to make sure we have a better gender balance. Because I'm being stared at by Mary there. You have your influence. Ruben, would you want to come in?
Yeah, unfortunately, but...
Are you coming to reconcile us?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, okay. I will try to reconcile, because I agree with Labour absolutely. It needs to be a holistic approach. I agree we cannot come and present some plans for somebody without understanding the contents inside. And the only way we can do it is considering 3 stakeholders, not 2 stakeholders. Because we're always talking about governments to governments or governments to local. I'm adding the one more element for this discussion is diaspora. Because one element we're doing in Armenia is Armenia represents 25 countries, small size, which below the radar for IFIs, for donors, for investors, because if not disaster happening in Armenia or Moldova or Burundi, nobody will care about this country because we are so small. The way we did it, we combined commercial and philanthropic approaches. We did a strategic vision and invest $500 million in 10 years' time, try to develop the program, not being our program, not being government program, but being community, government, and private diaspora project. And the execution came from the international diaspora who knows the standards and at the same time knows local grounds. Because the problem of the local people, they think survival mode. We're not thinking about big idea. You've been in Dilijan, some of you. You saw the school. If I would tomorrow do survey, say, we want to build the Dilijan school in the local people, they will say, no way. Let's do 150 school repairing compared to building one big school. And the politician cannot do it either, this school, because it will be disaster for them to improve one school. You know. But this school being transformation, right? He brings 82 country kids. So I think it's a very important element for reconciliation of 2 positions. The government to government is over. We have a private-public partnership, whereas the civil society needs to be part of the stakeholder, and in no chance would you can do just commercial or government program without social, philanthropic, and commercial project together. That's why the plan needs to be combined, holistic, real holistic approach. When you're combining the social, philanthropic, commercial, and long-term development project and a very high international standard, and bringing people mindset is local, being small, to the big picture, but not trying to teach them to do something which they don't understand.
All right, let me just tell you, there are 2 inputs here about China. In other words, maybe a Marshall Plan is irrelevant. From Maria Aguero, how has the proposed Marshall Plan taken China and its assistance and investment in Africa into account? And as well from Matthias Lucke, can we learn anything from the Chinese support for manufacturing industry and exports in Ethiopia? Think about your answers. Margarita, you were wanting to speak earlier. Do you want to come in about whether Africa is being adequately represented? Microphone.
Unfortunately, my English is so bad, and sometimes I don't understand very well. But when Bernard said what we have done in Nigeria to force the people go. I was so yes,
angry.
Because you know Total company.
And so you know Shell, and do you have
yes.
No, I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry. I cannot accept that. No.
No.
Use a microphone. Use a microphone.
Capitalism is responsible of all the damage of.
No. I want to go slowly and to show you when we are on the ground. Perhaps I am just a mom, a simple grandmother who look after a very simple children. And I can see what happened when big company come. Sometimes we think when you are here, you see the picture, you see that they have invested the money perhaps on the ground, but it's only the big, for example, African company, those politicians who will keep the money, and the people who live near those areas will be obliged to leave, but you will not see that in the newspaper.
Okay, well, let's check with John. Let's check with John Prendergast. I mean, there you have this assessment of the role of major corporations, building on what we've heard from Günter Nooke about where the money would go and who it might support if it happens. Do you see the possibility there, the potential for culture change, given what you said about significant large organizations which are operating there, international organizations in Africa?
Well, for large-scale job creation, of course, private investment, multilateral, multinational investment is critical. And creating the rule of law and the operational environment for that money to be invested properly is utterly key. So,
can it be done?
Absolutely. It's been done in many countries in Africa, but not in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, what you had is a kleptocracy that was reinforced and deepened by the irresponsibility of these major multinational oil companies who came in and just put suitcases of massive amounts of money under the table in order to get concessions. It's still going on in Nigeria and Angola and a number of other countries where the Gulf of Guinea is one of the fastest growing oil reserves in the world. And so, you know, that unless you deal with that aspect of things, all the other things you're trying to do in a place like Nigeria or Angola where transparency is non-existent, it's just undermined. But that doesn't mean you don't keep trying to address the operating environment in which that investment, that foreign investment occurs.
Is China competing against Germany and a Marshall Plan? And the implication from a couple of the points here is that really China is embedding itself so deeply that really something like this could become almost marginal compared to the strategic investment being made by China.
I think because China's investment has largely been around the natural resource sector, so you want to create a much wider, deeper investment set of investment possibilities for private sector individuals in those countries in Africa and around the world. So I think, but China unfortunately undermines the international system attempting to improve
Are they
transparency.
prolonging the kleptocracy?
They undermine the efforts to try to improve human rights. They undermine the efforts to try to deal with the anti-corruption agenda on the ground. So I think, I mean, in general terms. But in some places, you take South Sudan as a great example. Because their money got flushed down the toilet because of war, they are now becoming a constructive actor on the peace front. So it's in China's self-interest over time to address some of these problems which put their investments at risk.
Hina, your reflection, given what John has just said about human rights and the role of the PRC in this?
Look, I think exactly because of what John has just said, let's say that if China is playing a role in doing the big infrastructure projects in Africa, infrastructure projects or natural resources, etc., and they are not interested. It's not that they are neglecting. They're just not interested in transparency, in good governance. They're not interested in human rights. Why don't the others who have an interest in Africa pitch in rather than compete with China or think of China as a competitor in those areas? We have suffered There is no doubt, because of certain badly applied or mal-motivated aid injections in our countries. So I'm not kind of absolving the international community or international donors, let's say, countries, of having some interest, which is not necessarily driven by the welfare of the people of those countries where they are giving aid. But let me also, I think that this conversation has to go in another direction. It's always easy to say it's somebody else's fault. We have our internal problems, which have also caused us a great deal of anguish in terms of blocking democratic development, in terms of communal peace. Nobody came from outside to drive different ethnic communities to fight each other. Nobody came from outside to take on sectarian violence in our countries and create those divisions. Those did exist. That's why I'm saying that just development aid cannot help if you think of development aid in the terms that I heard that being spoken of. Development aid for us, and by the way, I'm not on the defensive about international financial cooperation. As a human rights lawyer, I know it's a part of the human rights framework. Development cooperation is a part of financial cooperation that the international law approves of in order to promote and protect human rights, which includes social and economic rights. So that's fine, but also remember that there are, and I want the audience also to understand that when we say that there are certain things that have happened because of interventions which have not necessarily been correctly motivated, we also should not look away from the fact that we are aware that we have internal issues. We have internal issues that create instabilities, internal issues that create violence, and that only we can deal with. So if the international community only wants to deal with our governments, this will not happen. International community must find ways, innovatively, to interact with civil society organizations, with local leadership, so that these problems, they can help people to resolve. They can help people to do reconciliation and peace within their own communities. Also, I dislike the idea that development aid should be driven by the motive of preventing immigration. No, development aid should not be conditioned on that. What happens if millions of euros are put into Africa or any part of Africa and immigration still continues? We've been speaking in the morning saying immigration cannot be prevented and should not be prevented because it's not, it's not an evil phenomenon or a harmful phenomenon. But at the same time, it is good to have an idea of how international cooperation will help states and societies to stabilize, overcome the challenges of poverty, overcome the challenges of misgovernance. So I would say that's a good idea, but at the same time, we must understand that when we talk about international assistance, we also talk about responsibility in providing that assistance, and that responsibility is to the people and not to governments.
There are 2 or 3 Africans also in the audience, even if they're living now in Germany. What I'd like to do is Barbara Ishinger's idea, actually, about asking you what you think you need in a place like Africa. I'm sorry, I don't know your names, but there are 2 or 3 of you at the back. As we're discovering in many parts of Europe, often the politicians and those at the top are way out of touch with the reality of what is happening. What about over there? About what you think, about what the next generation of Africans are wanting when you come to listen to the plan for something like a Marshall Plan, please.
Well, I feel like somewhat the Marshall Plan might not apply. I feel like we need to get back to the grassroots and empower these people, since they're the next generation and they're the ones coming up to make this change. So by empowering these people from the grassroots level to rise up, it might make a better change, rather than just giving foreign aid for this and that. Doesn't really prove effective. So if we'll go that on a more local level, I think it would work to improve the situation, not just on the government level and institutional levels.
Hello. I suppose having a Marshall Plan for Africa or Nigeria would be a good idea, but the only obstacle I see that stands in front of that is that how are you going to make sure that the money actually gets to the people? Because Nigeria is a country with corrupt politicians and a corrupt government, and giving the money to the politicians doesn't mean that the money actually gets used in the country. They might use it to pay some other debts, just put in the pockets. So how are you going to make sure that that actually works? It's a fine idea and all, but there's still a problem with the politicians and how the money actually gets used in the country.
All right, thank you. Anyone else, please? Would you like to speak? En français? Vous voulez parler en français?
Je suis désolé, je dois parler français. En fait, moi, c'est d'abord une grande surprise d'entendre parler du plan Marshall, parce que c'est la toute première fois que j'entends parler de ce plan. Ça veut dire que je n'étais pas du tout informé.
I need to translate. He's very surprised that there's any talk about the Marshall Plan. It's the first time he's ever heard of the Marshall Plan for Africa.
Je travaille dans un pays inconnu, la République centrafricaine, et dans un village inconnu de la République centrafricaine, à 300 km de la capitale, et donc dans une brousse, au milieu des villageois qui ne savent rien de ce plan Marshall.
Il travaille dans un...
No, in English.
Sorry. It was not to explain what he said.
He's
working in a village.
You're sacked as my translator.
Yes. No, but I'm very happy to speak French with you a bit. It will give you sort of other idea of the world. So he's in the bush and, okay, very far from Bangui, 300 kilometers.
Alors, je serais plus intéressé de savoir comment le plan Marshall a été élaboré, d'où vient l'idée et comment cette idée progresse actuellement. Parce que c'est très important.
He wants to know the way you elaborate this Marshall Plan and the progress you have done.
Et je ne peux pas balayer du revers de la main tout le plan Marshall. Certainement, il y a de très bonnes idées dedans que nous devons prendre en compte, mais aussi et surtout, il y a beaucoup d'idées qui doivent venir de l'intérieur du continent africain, tel que ça a été exprimé tout de suite.
Oui, good ideas certainly coming from you, but the majority of the ideas should come from the inside, that is to say from Africa.
Par rapport à tous les problèmes de la guerre en Afrique, je sais très bien que l'Africain ne sait pas fabriquer des armes et que...
Il sait les acheter. Hein?
Oui, il sait les acheter, ne sait pas fabriquer des armes. Donc,
no, but please.
Cependant, et je
L'Africain doesn't know how to build arms, to build up.
Cependant, je sais aussi qu'il y a beaucoup de mal qui se passe. Parfois, quand les gens n'ont même pas des armes fabriquées en Occident, ils ont la capacité de prendre leurs machettes ou des fusils de chasse pour faire du mal aussi. Donc, nous avons une grande responsabilité à notre niveau. On ne peut pas toujours accuser les autres comme si c'est eux qui nous apportent toujours la guerre, parce qu'au finish, c'est nous qui tirons, c'est nous qui tuons. Et tout comme ça se passe aussi ailleurs.
Merci mon père. Well, he said that they have a big responsibility because at the end of the day, despite of the fact that they don't know how to get armed, etc., they have the machete and they are the people killing their own people. So they have a responsibility and we don't have to accuse, or they don't have to accuse the others always. Sorry for our good lady who left, but well.
But Günter Nooke, as we bring this to an end, I mean, there you look, there's only a small number of people in this room, but this sense that is there a danger that a Marshall Plan for Africa is patronizing, is ill-conceived, and will not target those who need to be targeted, and even suspicion, which we've just heard, that a massive investment will not stop the migration challenge, even because so many people like to migrate and want to migrate anyway.
Because it's the way we live. Yeah. The Marshall Plan is about much more we have discussed, but I like to repeat several issues. What was mentioned about rural areas and about the development of the plan. It's about a discussion inside the ministry, of course, but I have traveled through Africa more than I haven't counted, 35 countries. The minister was there, and we have close cooperation with partner countries in more than 25 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. So we know a little bit about the continent in the development ministry. So, and who is writing down the plan is not only who is bringing into the plan the ideas. So there's much more inside. For instance, digitalization was mentioned. Of course, that's an issue. The informal sector is very important. We are speaking about big global mining companies, for instance, corporates from our perspective of the formal sector. Only 10% of the economy is a formal sector in Africa. We have 80–90% in the informal sector, in rural areas, in small villages. So we have to use the knowledge of the diaspora, the money of the diaspora, and the ideas from the ground, and put our money into such a system. We are try to create or to buy a platform to bring together the village, the diaspora, and the ODA, the money from the German taxpayers or the European taxpayers, to promote such an investment in very different areas in Africa. Even what Mr. Kouchner was mentioned should be possible as a kind of shopping list, what people can finance without any corruption, with new IT technologies, even blockchain technologies. There will be a massive change. We can develop a country without some institutions. We are thinking here in Germany or in Europe, they are very important to have for registering the building where you have to go to. You can register an entire country with a mobile phone or a smartphone. So that's also an issue.
Right.
We have spoken about the governments. We use our development implementation agencies in Germany, GIZ and KfW, the bank, the development bank. We do not spend the money directly to the government. So of course we know the corruption, but that creates a lot of overheads, and not the biggest amount of money is not spent for the people in Africa most needed, but it's for the development industry and high potentials in the international arena. So that's maybe not what we have to do for Africa. So I can say a lot about what is also inside and behind the background of Marshall Plan and the development of the Marshall Plan. And also the lady was mentioned Libya. I have to say that Germany did not support the Security Council resolution in 2011. But 3 African countries, Nigeria, South Africa, and Gabon, and I was in a meeting with John Ping, the chairperson of the European Union. He said the German position was like the position of the African Union. That means my African countries did wrong in the Security Council. So it was not enough time to discuss this. It was the French president who was interested to come as a big, okay, I do not want to claim the French president again. Right. So, and of course, we have to debate much more what we are doing. And Libya was an issue where the German foreign minister Westerwelle and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel was not in line with what has happened in the Security Council overnight, and the change of the mindsets in the Arabic League and in the United States, right, and so on. So another issue is also empowering people on the ground. I think that's all those things are very important, but do not underestimate that well-trained people will also get a perspective for their life, and what I mentioned, a decent job and also a well-paid job. And why not create such industrial parks, such economic zones in Africa? Why not jobs in Africa for Africans? We cannot accept that everyone who is able and have the money can come to Europe. That's the debate over the last year in the European Union and in every member state of the European Union.
Good to know. Thank you very much. Let me just come to John, because that particular intervention there about concern about where the money, whatever money it is, will go, that from the next generation in an increasingly digital environment. What's your response, given what you're investigating about what you call kleptocracy, about the ability to create good governance in a way which will reassure the next generation that it's worth sticking around, they will have a decent, they will be able to create work for themselves, they will have power for themselves, they will have utilities, they will be able to operate, and they'll be able to operate with a degree of reassurance that they do not have to sort of succumb to what you call kleptocracy?
Well, again, it goes back to the incentives. I think if the incentive structures are geared towards an ease of looting the state, you know, these governments are able to steal and externalize billions of dollars with no consequence, of course it will continue. But it's pretty, you know, there are very basic international measures that can be, instruments that can be utilized to counter that. And I didn't understand that. I worked on foreign policy for 30 years, and I didn't fully understand the power of the international banking system if they are engaged in an effort to counter money laundering. Here's the key point, away from the jargon. Roughly 80% of the transactions that occur, financial transactions that occur in the world, are in dollars and in euros. So when a transaction occurs in a dollar and a euro, or a euro, even if the persons that are, or companies that are exchanging are not American or European, that the European and American central banks have jurisdiction over that money because if crimes are committed. So first you have a crime of the money being stolen from the country. Second, you have a second crime is committed when the money is laundered through the international banking system. If we had the political will, and it's a choice, just as we did in countering terrorism, as we do in countering drug trafficking, if we went after the money that's being stolen from Africa, it would be literally billions and billions of dollars that could be frozen and seized and recovered and returned back to the kinds of community-led development initiatives that African civil society, local government, and even some reforming governments around the continent would be able to lead. I think that's the real potential plan, leaving the word Marshall, the real plan for Africa's future investment and growth and development. That internally generated, those internally generated resources where the kleptocrats are disincentivized from stealing from the state, when the only way they can do business is to do it cleanly in the context of the rule of law, so that investors come and they know that they've got to invest and it's going to go for the purposes that they intended to go, and that it will be benefiting the people of Africa. That, I think, is really the answer to a lot of these problems. We can't, in this day and age, the United States has turned its back on providing development assistance. Who knows what this government is going to do before 4 years is over, if he makes it that long. And the European Union, aside from the defensive aid it's providing for the migration stuff, which we've already talked about, some of the shortcomings there, I don't know where that money is going to come from. We've got to look internally, and Africa has the resources. It is a fabulously wealthy continent. There are extraordinary natural resource wealth, and most of it is being looted and stolen right now.
All right, John Prendergast, thank you. Can you do it in, can you answer it in a minute, John? Yeah. And how do you do it, says Bernard Kouchner?
Because it's very, very important, thank you for the extra 30 seconds, is that you utilize these tools of financial pressure that were created in response to the countering terrorism. The anti-money laundering statutes that are now on the books of almost every government and are part of international treaties. You can go after money that is laundered through the international financial system. You just have to tell the banks it's a priority. Circulars can be generated by the German government, the American government, the British government, the European Union, to say we are concerned about money laundering in this country or in this particular sector, this money, these people, these persons of interest. Do your job, banks, and regulate. You're not supposed to be allowing money laundering to occur, and now we're going to start watching you. And if you don't enforce your basic money laundering responsibilities, we're going to start fining you. That's what we did for counterterrorism stuff. That's what we did to get the banks to enforce the Iran sanctions. We could do the same for the looting that's going on in Africa.
Thank you, John. Can I thank all the panelists, including those who arrived without expectation? Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, John.
You are a dreamer. This is just